Fáilte go dtí an episód sa Ceist na Teangan. Podcrail faoin Nghaeilge agus a star de aine atá fistrop faoi our gadrúh léithí agus a role in our bhéiniúlacht. Welcome to the Language Question, a podcast about the Irish language and its history for anyone curious about our relationship with it and its role in our identity. Maris Gnách, bí cinnte a chlárú ag thelanguagequestion.com/resources chun de acmhaní fálam to Sarah Nashka all agus a bheith ar an eolas faoi gachród atá ar siúl ar an show. As usual, please be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to be sure to get your complimentary, valuable learning resources and to stay up to date, upcoming episodes, guests, and to receive exclusive content. Peish Gaeilge, Shulling, Gomwena tú Sultas. Anyhow, here goes. I hope you enjoy it. Alan Titley is an illustrious scholar, playwright, novelist, screenwriter, short story writer, poet, reviewer, commentator, and journalist. He was head of the Irish department in St. Patrick's College before becoming Professor of Irish in UCC, where he remains Professor Emeritus. He is a member of the Royal Irish Academy, and he has written many novels, collections of short stories, plays, and some poetry, including On Van Vasse, the longest poem in modern Irish literature. His plays have been performed in the Peacock and Samuel Beckett theatres and broadcast on RTE and BBC. He has won many awards. His An Tuairiscéal Gaeilge is the definitive work on the Irish language novel. His works have been translated into many languages, including Russian, Italian, French, Croatian, Polish, Arabic, Romanian, English, and Gaelic. Alan a cara, tá fáilte is fitheróid ar an show agus tá thar bheith buíoch díobh as a bheith linn.
Tá míle fáilte róid in Ín, míle fáilte róid.
Alan, I am so grateful to you for joining us here today. It is really a tremendous honour and privilege to have you with us here on the show. It's been a wish of mine for a very long time to get the opportunity to speak to you. And Alan, while I mean, as will be clear there from the very brief bio that I had to condense down because the amount of things that could have been referred to were literally just immense. You have an extraordinary career, but for let's say for many of those who are listening here today to the show, who perhaps maybe won't have experience of reading Irish themselves directly, won't have experience of the literature and so on directly, and as a result may not be as familiar with you as perhaps I'm sure they will become as we speak. Would you mind going back to the very beginning, something that I like to do with guests, and to speak about your, let's say, beginnings with the language? What did it look like for you growing up, and how did you kind of become the person who spent their life then living and writing in the language?
Okay, I tried to go way back. I was born in Cork City in Douglas Turner's Cross, if you want to put it like that. And I think I was fortunate insofar as I went to a primary school, a big primary school, Gaeilge Ceist in Turner's Cross in Cork, and later on Gaeilge Ceist, the secondary school, which is quite famous, I hope, secondary school as well. And we were fortunate, I think, in that it wasn't an all-Irish school, but most of the subject, or many of the subjects were taught through Irish. And we say to take Gaeilge Ceist, the primary school, this is a big school. In fact, and I say this to people from time to time, I say it to my children and my grandchildren, God help us, and I say, there were 75 children in each classroom, maybe 76, 77. How we learned anything, I have no idea whatsoever. It did have the advantage, however, of if you didn't know something, you could kind of duck, you know? You could hide when you didn't know something. So there were advantages to having a huge class. But because we learned some subjects through Irish, I mean, we did maths, we did history, and in secondary school it was the same. We did science through English and Latin through English. We did history, geography, commerce through Irish. So inevitably, you would be good at the language. I think that would be part of it. I think everybody in the school was good at the language in some way or the other. And so I never remember a time when I had to, I mean, obviously in primary school, I wouldn't have known it that well. But I remember in the primary school, we had a poetry book, Finghin Mac Cárthaigh, when you look at it nowadays, and we did, you know, the first part of Cúirteann Van Ihe, big, long, famous 18th century poem, Buchaná me siúl hiúis na haun bhain se hós an drocha trom, neck the greed to gleam and plague on Vatican wheel of Section Lake, Yalach Mulfreen or Heen Loch Rain, a Tolerant Tear, we did that in the primary school. So we knew a lot of what was going on. Went into the secondary school, it was the same thing. We did some subjects through Irish. And I think two things kind of happened to me really. One was I was involved in debates in school, and English debates and Irish debates. And we're involved in Irish debates. I kind of thought I didn't have enough Irish to say the things I really wanted to say. So I had to kind of dig deeper, if you know what I mean. And I'd have to work out ways of saying things that maybe weren't, if you like, God help us, on the curriculum. So there had to be ways of doing things. And something else happened as well. I remember I have a brother, Brian, great guy, 2 years older than me. He was doing the leaving cert when I was doing the inter-cert. And I always had a kind of a habit of not doing the stuff on the course. I would read, for example, if Pádraig O'Connor is on the course, and I wouldn't read the stuff necessarily on the course. I'd read other stuff that he wrote. It's just kind of a perverse quirk of my own. And my brother was doing the leaving cert, and I remember I was looking, we were sitting at the kitchen table as we did a homework, and I picked out his leaving cert history book, and I was reading some of the poetry in English and in Irish. And I came across Sharon Keating's great poem, Stjól ordva foil, ni chodlin ihe, de viroig broch me, dala pobl dealish. And I said, this is great poetry. This is great, great, great poetry. And I mean, I like poetry. And it suddenly dawned on me there was a lot of stuff out there that I was unaware of. And I suppose around the same time, you know, we were doing English in school, and we had some of these awful writers like Addison and you know, these essayists that we were doing, and they meant nothing to me. And we were kind of told we should read Thackeray, who was terribly boring. Jane Austen, God knows, it was Mark Twain who said you should have been strangled at birth. Some would agree, but I say that people are shocked. But so these didn't really mean anything to me. But suddenly, we had a wonderful teacher in Central Roberto Hurtel, who is still with us. He's 90-something years of age. And he was a great guy, particularly if you were good. I'm told he wasn't so great if he wasn't that good. If you were reasonably good, he was. And he brought in Sean O'Riordan's poetry. This was not on the course. He taught us songs. And in fact, he was teaching us a lot of stuff that wasn't on the course because we were good enough to do it. And I do remember there was one guy in the cat, he was sitting right in front of me. He shall be nameless in case he's looking at this podcast. And he was objecting to this stuff. We were doing stuff that's not on the course. But myself and a few others took him into a dark corner of the yard, and we persuaded him otherwise, and we went on reading stuff on the course. So I kind of got to know this. And I remember Roberto Hurtel said to us, for example, if you go down to Russell's bookshop, Liam Rochelle's bookshop, you'll see him there sometimes. And suddenly dawned us, there are poets alive. You know, they're not all dead. And at the same time, I was beginning to hear, I remember going with my dad, who loved going, who would know Irish, and going out to Gugan Barra. And on the way home, he would drop in for a pint in Ballingeary, Bélan Rairig. And there were 3 or 4 guys in there talking Irish. And this was the first time you really heard native speakers Irish, and kind of said, well, this is live. And so I began to realize that there was a whole lot of stuff out there. It just wasn't in books. It was something to do with me, something to do with... And then I think I also had the good fortune when I went to St. Patrick's College, Drumcondra, as a student. So I had a very good basis in this. So we were in school debates, for example. We should have won the All-Ireland Gaeilge debating final. We were robbed. I've no doubt we were saying that at all. And everyone thought we were robbed. In fact, we walked out of it afterwards, and the teachers agreed with us. So anyway, that's a separate issue. But we got to the, you know, this kind of rankles after 70 years. You have to say the stuff. So when I went to St. Patrick's College, Drumcondra, there were a lot of students there from the Gaeilge, because there was a policy on the state that Gaeilge people had preference. And you had these Coláiste Ullmhuachain preparatory colleges like Ballyvourne, like Coláiste Éin and Galway and others. And so, and we were the first year when that didn't hold firm. But the year ahead of me, there was a lot of people from the Gaeilge. And I said the Gaeilge, they were Connemara, they were Kerry, they were Cork, they were Waterford, they were Donegal. And for the first time, I heard these guys talking Donegal Irish. and hadn't a clue what was going on for a while. But eventually, you listen. And so we'd have a natural conversation, guys from Connemara, touch the kite marsh, and so I thought this was great. So suddenly I kind of knew all kinds of Irish, and I thought it was wonderful. And again, when I was there, I was involved in debates, so I was involved in stuff. So that's kind of how it happened. And I do remember I went to teach in Africa. First job I had was teaching in Africa. And I only brought a handful of books with me. One of them was in Teangan. Not sure why. I think I just had got a copy of it. Another was Ceolar Sheech, or a collection of songs. And they were kind of with me, and also I was a member of a club, and I managed to get a member, got booked by Christopher Flynn, by Martin O'Kine. So I was kind of reading away along the way. And I found that this spoke to me in a way that, for example, and I love English literature, at least a lot of it, all kinds of literature, but this spoke to me in a way that others did not. And so, driving through, would say, West Cork, you know that, that song came from there. Going into Waterford, going to Ring, yes, that song came from there. Nicholas Tobin sang here. Sliabh Galgoo and Afela. Going up through Tipperary, Sharon Keating was there. Pudding Hackett was there. Unruh Sullivan was over in Kerry. So I knew these places. It was kind of a map of what was going on with these people in my head all the time. And that's kind of how it happened. And I found, and I do remember, and maybe it was always kind of there, I do remember in secondary school in Crease 3, we had a very good teacher, we had a good course. But I remember there was a glass case with books in it. There was no library. Libraries weren't in schools, but they were building up a library, beginning a library. And there were books there, Dían Bhuail Today by Diarmuid O'Sullivan, Níl Magna Tinnihe by Browndown and Devlin. And I saw these behind a glass case. I didn't know them. You couldn't read them. You weren't allowed to take them, or it didn't dawn on me. But again, I knew there was stuff outside the course, and I kind of followed on that. So when I came back from Africa, and I have stories about that as well, but that's another one. When I came back from Africa, I was teaching deaf children, which was great as well. And that happened by accident, as many things in one's life happens by accident, because there was a friend of mine teaching the school for the deaf. I went up and I spoke to him. And while I was talking to him, a brother came along and said, would you like a job? So I said, yeah. So there I was teaching deaf children for 5 years. In the meantime, I went to university at night, because if you had been in St. Pat's, it wasn't a degree, it was a diploma. So, and I couldn't do an honours degree, so I did the pass degree at night. And I enjoyed it. And again, I had some great teachers there because I was interested in it. I did English and philosophy as well. But Irish was what I kind of wanted to do. And it sort of grew organically. It just kind of grew as I was going along. And of course, I was good at it. And I liked taking chances. I liked as I said, reading outside the course, doing things somewhat differently. And then I did what was it called? The exam to do the MI. You had to do a qualifying exam. So in that one, I had to do Scottish Gaelic and Old Irish, mainly on my own. And that was interesting. The Scottish Gaelic lecturer, he was a Scot guy, and I've no harm in saying that he was a total bollocks. He was a prick. And when I went in to look for help, he said to me, first of all, he didn't talk to me. Then he said, Donegal, get your macha shaw, wacha. They learn venting a shaw, that's a that. So I said, I'm learning this language myself, which I did, and I know it quite well as it happens. But I said, that's kind of happened. And teaching, so I did an MA, and I discovered one day I was inside in UCD where I was doing the MA, and I saw an advertisement for a job in St. Patrick's College, Drumcondra, my own college. And the application had to be in the next day. So I knocked on a few doors and said, will you stand? Will you be a referee for me? And I think I got it in with about 5 minutes to go, and I got appointed there, and I spent 32 years in St. Patrick's College, Drumcondra, head of department later on. And we had a great department. It was wonderful. And I was teaching the student teachers, and later on we had a BA and a PhD program. And again, you met people from all over the country, and the great thing about it. And I suppose you get very humble when you see extremely bright students that you have to teach, and they know a lot more about lots of things than you do. And it also meant, of course, when you're teaching people, when I remember doing on Tahar Padar O'Leary's scale, Mushkeel Féin for the Leaving Cert, and the way that you where you forget most things in a book, you read a book, and we all read books, and there's hundreds of goddamn things here, you forget them, and but you remember bits. And I remember there was a sentence in it where he was teaching somebody. He said, "Is far a vuinen muine dine no more a vuinen faulam." That teaching, you learn better by teaching than you learn by learning. So if you have to teach something, you have to learn it as well, and you're learning. So when I'd be doing new courses, I had to learn a lot about it. I kind of grew up out of that, I suppose. So that's where I was. And then UCC came along, and I didn't have any real connections. I mean, I wasn't in UCC, but I did connections. I'd been external examiner there for a while, and I had also been on Cork University Press committee, which is another kind of an accident, their publishing committee, because when Michael Davitt, the poet, wonderful guy, he was running a programme, and he had invited guests to present the programme. And he called me one day and he said, "Will you present the programme? There's a TV programme about Cork University Press." So I said, "I will." So I sat and I interviewed people. It was a programme about Cork University Press. And I do remember I had my work. I'd never presented a TV programme before, but why not? And I remember I had all these questions. And I do remember I was running out of questions. I was on my last question when the time was up, and I said, "My God, time is up. That's great." I got along to it. I remember Moira Vacoty was the last one I asked the question. So that was kind of, but when I'd done that, Cork University Press kind of said, "Well, he knows his stuff." So they invited me to be part of their publishing committee. So I had connections with UCC, and my brother had been there. And so, of course, I knew the place quite well from being in and out of it. And so when the job of Professor Modern Irish came up, when we say Modern Irish, it's not contemporary. Modern Irish goes from the 13th century, from about 1250 to the present day. So I was in charge of that. And again, I loved UCC. It was a great place. And there was no kind of negativity about Irish. I felt, where there had been in other places, some negativity. And I felt there was none. There was a great positive. And again, the students were great. And I just...
Was Sean O'Toole there that time?
No, he wasn't. Sean O'Toole, in fact, had just died shortly before I got the job. He wasn't. Sean Quilline had been professor just before me. Sean O'Toole had been there before that. And again, I knew Sean a bit, not very well, but I knew him a bit. So they were gone. There was a changing of the guard, if you know what I mean. So I kind of... and I enjoyed that. And again, I'd like to have it longer there, but the years caught up in me and I had to go. So that was it, When your time comes, your time comes. There's nothing you can do about it.
When your number's up, your number's up, yeah. But that's fascinating, Alan. And I want to move from there into the writing, if you don't mind. But before I do that, I've just been curious listening to you there, fascinated listening to you there. You have had this extraordinary academic career, driven by your own, curiosity in the language. It strikes me listening to you there. I mean, from just a kitchen table and you have Saturn kitchen kind of there, and you decide to discover that poetry. So that was obviously a natural intellectual curiosity you had yourself. What did language look like outside of education? I mean, was it something that you were using it in your daily life or in social contexts?
Yeah. I mean, I was never really a part of. A part of all kinds of stuff. I mean, I've been on board in our Gaeilge. I've been on. I remember Colm O'Cuanachain in Cork. He was a lovely guy, and even when I was in secondary school, he used to go around and speak at meetings after church, and he would. And he was going around getting shops and to put up notices in Irish, and so he was a great guy. So I'm involved in a lot of the social, like Imran, which is a cultural festival in Dublin. I was involved with that. I was on board in our Gaeilge. I was even on board in a Gaeilge, which is another, and that kind of happened also. I think most things to me happen by accident. Is that I was Michael D. Higgins. Was coming to some kind of a book launch that I was involved in. It wasn't a book of mine, but it was a book launch. And Michael D came in and he kind of said to me as he was passing, he said, "That was a great book you wrote about the church in Ireland." And I didn't write any book on church, that was my brother, you see. So about church, state and control of education in Ireland. And that was grand. And then I got an invitation from Michael D to write. They were setting up, Labour Party setting up an Irish language policy. And I said, look, I'm not good on this kind of stuff, but I will write the introduction. I'll tell you why we think this is important, which I did. And then when he was going out of, suddenly I discovered I was on board in Gaeilge. I got invited. So I'm involved in all kinds of things. And we spoke a lot of Irish at home, not all the time, spoke a lot. And, a daughter married a guy from Connemara, and another daughter who wrote plays for a while and that kind of stuff. So, we kind of, and a lot of my friends are Irish-speaking friends, obviously, as well. So, and as you know, you're kind of in the middle of a world where no matter what you do, English is there. And there's no problem with that, because there's a great English language tradition as well in Ireland. And great ballad tradition, great singing tradition, great literary tradition. That's all part of it as well. And I find, I think what I find, I won't say disturbing, but is that there's a kind of apartheid between the literatures, or between the, in other words, there's a line somewhere in one of Brian Friel's plays, I think it's Freedom of the City, where one of the ghosts said something like, after he's been shot on Bloody Sunday, says something like, they knew everything about us, but we knew nothing about them, meaning the RUC and the police and so on. And I often say, well, if you're writing in Irish, we know everything about what's going on in English, but they don't know what's going on about what's happening in Irish. And you don't find, I'm not going to start complaining, you don't find books in Irish reviewed, you don't find writers in Irish interviewed, and it feels that you're completely outside the loop, as if that division is there. Apart from, there are some people, for example, Declan Kyberd in English was very good. Bob Welch, who was in college with me and was professor of English in Coleraine, and unfortunately died more than 10 years ago, and a lovely, lovely guy. And he knew perfect Irish, and he wrote stuff in Irish as well. So there would have been some people at the high echelons of English literature in Ireland who were, but most of them don't. And I think that is a pity. And I think that is a big divide. That said, I've written books in English, and I've written about English literature. I've written about singing, I've written about O'Casey, and written, no problem, just part of what we do. It doesn't work the other way around, which to me is a bit of a tragedy, not for us, but for the country, that people are not aware of this, this wonderful language, which was the language of the country for thousands of years. That's it,
Yeah, that's a really, really important topic, and it's one that I want to dive into with you in a little bit in more detail, if that's in a moment, if that's okay. But before we go there, I want to just talk about your own progression. So we've spoken now about your, what it was like growing up, how then education and acquisition of the language, and your kind of, the way you kind of immersed yourself in it. Talk to me then, and then of course a career, in education in the language. But talk to me then about writing. How did that come about? And how did writing as Gaeilge become was that always the obvious thing for you to write in Irish?
No, in ways, yes. I do remember when we were younger, years ago, when there was no television. I remember at this time there was no television. I remember when television came. I remember when, it makes me seem ancient, I don't feel ancient at all. I remember when telephones came. But I remember on wet days, of which there were many, and myself and my brother, we'd write stories. We'd sit down, and I think it might be up in the attic somewhere. I know my mother kept them. And we'd kind of comics. You would kind of draw pictures. I wasn't very good at drawing pictures. My brother was. But we'd make up stories. I remember making up all kinds of stories along the way. So that was there. And I do remember as well, when I was in St. Pat's, Stefan Hauerheim, a wonderful lecture we had. And he kind of said one day, well, why don't you write something, And I had another guy who encouraged, but it wasn't so much that. But when I was in Nigeria, I started writing a novel. Maybe I had nothing else to do, but maybe it was always there. There was a seed there all the time, because I do remember even in secondary school, I would rather write a story or a poem than write an essay. So that was, if you had a permission to do so. And I remember even in primary school, I would kind of make things up. I won't go into that again. But when, because of the huge class in primary school, they would be with the 77 or 78 people, whoever it was in the class. And there were kids who couldn't read, and this was a shock to me because I could read. I mean, I just was lucky I was able to read. And he would write essays on the board and kind of leave gaps, and then he'd put the words on the board and you'd fill in the gaps, So everyone kind of wrote the same essay. I remember seeking permission can I write my own? So if you had one like blackberry picking and you went out and you went into the field, it was all blackberry picking. We were city boys. Like, we didn't pick berries. But anyway, that was a standard essay. But I remember writing, in the middle of picking blackberries, a spaceship arrived from space and landed on the ground, and we dug a hole in the ground and went into these tunnels. I said, well, just use so there was something there all the time. But when I was in Nigeria, we finished teaching at 1:00, and I decided not to go to sleep. You could have a siesta, because if I weren't asleep, I'd stay asleep. So I stayed there and I started writing. And of course, I was writing this rather stupid story about a young teacher. Basically, it wasn't me, but it was somebody like me. And then he gets into trouble and gets arrested for something or other. And what happened was, this happened to me. I got arrested and I spent time in prison in Nigeria. You don't know this. I hope they don't find this out about me. Because when I was in Nigeria, I wrote a piece about the Biafran War, which was going on, for the Irish language magazine Core. And I noticed that my letters were being opened bit by bit. I had no idea why. And it appears, I found out later on, that they were watching me. And I won't go into details, but I did get arrested I was charged with loose talk, which meant that I supported Biafra. I was kind of put in jail, at least in the prison cell. I was there for a while. I was under house arrest. They were going to deport me and so on. So, and I wasn't deported, but I persona non grata, I can't go back to the country, it would appear. They may not find this out. If somebody watching this, they'll add this into and say, this guy can never come back here along the way. But I because this had happened to me, of what I'd written about, I said, I ain't going to write about myself anymore. And I don't. In my stories, I don't write, and I don't really like autobiographical writing saying, like, this guy, he's the awfulness of growing up like Frank McCarthy, awful Irish childhood. I had a great Irish childhood, so I can't write out that. I didn't suffer at home. The teachers weren't particularly brutal, We weren't dirt poor. We were poor enough, like most people were. We were dirt. So, like, I can't write about that. So I write out of my head. So I started another novel, which I wrote when I came back. And the first novel I wrote was, again, stories are funny and poems are funny and plays. You don't know where the ideas come from. But I was staying with a friend of mine in Blessington Street in Dublin. And I remember it was a time, there were these lights that you could put on, you'd kind of get 20 seconds and they'd go off again. And I was staying upstairs in this fairly dilapidated house. And I remember climbing up the stairs, put on the light when I got in late one night, got up the stairs, and the light went off. And there was a bundle on the landing. And I thought it was a dead person. I thought it was a dead child. Boom. And that kind of image stayed with me. So that's where the novel Stieli El Piola came out of. And then the other one, Mershki Trevi, came out of, I'd read a lot of African literature and kind of said, well, what was it like for those people who grew up in Africa? And in that novel, there are no white people. There isn't one white person. They're all black, every single one of them. Or they're all Africans at least, which I thought which I wanted to do. So I was trying to find out what was it like for people in a revolutionary situation, and also for people in a situation who are kind of black Africans who are being Europeanized or becoming white. And so there's a kind of a clash in the novel about that, if you know what I mean. So that was kind of what I was interested in. And then I suppose, what did I write after that? I started writing some short stories because in some ways it was easier it's easier to write short stories. I got into trouble for saying that. I do remember when I was teaching in the college, and of course I didn't really start writing until I was in the college because I was studying before that anyway. But I do remember David Marcus. David Marcus was great with the Irish press and New Irish writing. But there was a lot of brouhaha about the Irish short story and how the Irish short story was special, and we were gifted by writing short story. And then you had people like Frank O'Connor and Sean O'Faoline and H.E. Bates and others saying, it is more difficult to write a short story than it is to write a novel. And I remember giving a lecture on the short story in the college, and nice sunny day like this, and the sun was coming in. And I was walking up and down, talking fluently, bullshitting about the short story, about how difficult it was, and if you put in a semicolon in the wrong place, you put in a full stop in the wrong place, it would ruin the story. And I remember, like a bolt out of the sky, I said to myself, this is shite. I don't believe a word of this. It's much more difficult to write a novel than it is to write a short story. And I remember having read Somerset Maugham, who had said once famously, he said, and he wrote many short stories, he said, if you're a writer, he said, you can write a story for a book, which is 30,000 words, and you can write the same story for a magazine, 3,000 words, if you do the same story. And in one, there isn't a word too many, and in the other, there isn't a word too less. And I said, that's what writing is. It isn't this thing that if you make a mistake, you keep on doing it. So I started writing. Then I was invited. I went home that night, I wrote an essay in English on which I called The Disease of the Irish Short Story, which I was saying that kind of stuff. It's not more difficult to write. And the Irish aren't special at short stories, because I heard the same thing when I'd been after you. We can write short stories. And I was resident reviewer for Hibernia in English. Hibernia was an old magazine run by John Mulcahy, I think. Came out every fortnight. It was a great magazine. It was a fortnightly one. It was current affairs and literature, current affairs and the arts. It was a great one. And so I was writing essays on writers I knew nothing about. I mean, so that was a different element. And that was in English along the way. So then I started writing short stories because it was easier to do so, And then, what was that? I was doing, and then I wrote one book, Leabhar Nóra Neon Lewin. When did I write that? And there are 100 stories or 100 stories in it, because one day, I was always writing bits of poetry, but there was another kind of, if you like, a conflict between that, because the Inca poets from UCC, Michael Davitt and Gabriel Russell, Leon Wurter, Yulia Nichona, and they were big news. And I do remember Sean O'Toole, whom I loved, and he was a great guy. But there was a thing called the Sense of Ireland, which was an Irish cultural festival sometime in the 1970s, check it out, in England. And he had a choosing of the Irish writers. And he chose nothing but poets. So Diarmuid O'Sullivan was a great writer at the time, Brown Devlin, these were novelists. None of them were Brown O'Hare. None of them were invited. And I remember saying, they're only interested in poetry. So I wrote another quirky essay, which I talked about the travelling circuses of poets. They didn't like that. And I said, poets were the only people who got invited to read. Prose writers never did. Still largely the case. And it was as if there were no novels in Irish, and there were novels in Irish. So that was one of the things. And I do remember when I was doing the PhD that you mentioned, which was on Tour Scale Gaeilge, I remember being at an Oireachtas prize-giving ceremony, and Robert McGorine, again, a guy who did great work with Irish, and I was talking to him and a few others, and I was telling him the work I was doing and how there were hundreds of novels in Irish. And then he went up to give the prizes, and one of the prizes now he said, well, we know, of course, that not many people have written novels in Irish. And I said, I've just told him, John. And there was a kind of a blockage about novels. So I kind of said, well, let's write, let's write novels as well. So, but they were there. And so when I was saying about the poetry thing, they were like, poets were colour of the moment all the time. No talk about people writing prose. And go into any bookshop. It is all novels. No, novels are. I remember being in England and I was looking for a book of poetry, and the person said, "Oh, poetry. Oh, yeah. It's over there with the esoterica." So it was there with like esoterical stuff. So I said, there's something bizarre in literature where it's mainly poetry. And there's another story, I'm bullshitting here, about Frank O'Connor when he was a librarian somewhere in County Wicklow, I think it was. And this big farmer came in one day and he was looking for a book of poetry. And Frank O'Connor sent him over and he came back later and he said, what's this? He said, poetry. I'm talking about poetry, pens, poetry. So anyway, that's right up. But I didn't publish any poetry for a long time after I did. In fact, the first Oireachtas prize I wrote was for poetry. And interestingly, it was for a long poem, because I'm a great believer in long poems as well, that kind of do something that you have to work at. But I wrote other short stories along the way. And then I wrote a novel, one of the ones I'd be really proud of, on Fardana, the man of art or the man of letters, if you like, which again grew out of one of these things that stays in your head. When I was doing the Masters and the PhD, the Masters in particular, I was learning bardic poetry. I read when I was going through this book, Irish Bardic Poetry, about this guy, Muriach Alban Chodala, which Brian O'Keefe said, one of the most interesting characters in Irish literature. And then Brian O'Keefe had written an article about him, he said this guy, he murdered a tax collector. He had to flee from Sligo. He went to Scotland. He fell out with them there. He went into crusades. I said, there's a great story in this. So I said, yeah, I mean, it was Brendan O'Divlin who first told me this. He said, there's a story told about people, somebody doing a writer's workshop. And in the writer's workshop, somebody says, if you want to write a bestseller, you have to have 4 elements. It has to be religion, royalty, sex, and mystery. So religion, royalty, sex, and mystery. And he said, the tutor said, okay, write a story. And some guy put up his hand straight away and said, I have a story. He said, you can't have a story so quickly. And he said, oh, I have. He said, what is it? He said, religion, royalty, sex, and mystery. Yes, sir. My God, said the Duchess, I'm pregnant. Who did it? So he said, they're all in together. So my story had it all, because there was religion. He wrote religious poetry. Royalty. He was a friend of King Rory O'Cruhuit, the last king of Ireland, and also the kings of Scotland. Sex. He had 13 children, I think it was. And mystery. Well, we don't know what happened to him when he finished. So we don't know what happened to him. It's reckoned that he went back to Scotland. Other people think he died here. So we don't know. So I wrote this in kind of a mock medieval Irish, if you know what I mean. And I enjoyed doing it, and I had to do a lot of research. I went to Scotland. I could speak Scottish Gaelic fairly well at that stage, which is another question entirely, different kind of a place. And I walked around where he was, and kind of, for no particular reason, the castle he was in, the places he went, as far as I could. I did the same in Ireland, kind of get a sense of what it was about. So, you have to do it. Now, he was on the Crusades. I didn't go to Jerusalem, and I didn't go to Egypt, but you can read about things. When you don't know it, you can imagine it. So that was the way along. So that was one of the big historical novels that I did. And on that one, I mean, again, when you talk about things strange that happened, I put in for the Oireachtas, and Sean O'Tuama, again, whom I love, and Sean McRaymond, whom I know very well, they gave it a quarter of the prize, because they said, it's not a novel. And I said, it is a novel. And I remember talking to Sean O'Tuama, his belief that a novel was like the 19th century novel about somebody that a character has to change, a bit like David Copperfield growing up, or it has to be about society. And I said, look, I've read hundreds of different kinds of novels, and that's not the way around. So his idea of what a novel was to me not right. Anyway, that's a separate issue. But that's what happens with literary prizes. Are not that important, except when you get a bizarre, or what you think is a bizarre judgment. That's it. On the other hand, when I think it was a newspaper in Nish they had a poll, or they'd sent some scholars or critics, what were the most important Irish novels, I think, or books. It came in at number 6 on Fardana, and I think it was the only one by a living author. The others were things like on Béal Buch, on Tilánach, Sheheb Leon Foss, and so on, Killeen Killa, and so on, whereas my one was there. So I said, yeah, somebody did. It's a good novel along the way. And I later wrote another novel about, again, with the same sort of idea, on Jan Fassa, which, interestingly, there's no word in Irish for a witch. And there were no witches in Gaelic Ireland. All the witches, like Alice Kittler, was in Kilkenny, which was a Northern city. And there was a witch in Youghal, which was another garrison town, if you like. There was one up in the island, Magee, which was a Presbyterian area up in County Antrim. So there were no word for witch. And the normal one, you can use Cailleach. But on Jan Fassa, a wise woman, is one of the words. So I called this. And this came again out of an article that I saw. No, it was again a sentence in a book by an essay by Princess Mac Cárthaigh, in a book called America Sheer. This is the way you get ideas. You're not looking for them, they come at you. And it is, it was about the Irish language in America. And he said, the first time Irish is mentioned in America is when this woman that we know as Goody Glover was hanged as a witch on Boston Common in November 1688. And I said, wow, that's interesting. Now, I discovered later when I wrote it, it wasn't the first reference. There was another reference a few years before that, but that's a separate issue. But strictly speaking, she was the first one. And then I saw an article by John Horgan, the commentator and professor of communications in DCU, again, a man I knew reasonably well. And he wrote an article about her. And I spoke to him about it, and he gave me a lot of information. And we don't know much about her. All we know about her is that she was tried as a witch. And we don't have a transcript of the trial, but we do have a guy talking about the trial. We do have somebody talking about seeing her being hanged. So I said, we know who she was. She must have been taken out of Ireland during Cromwell's ravages in Ireland, or after Cromwell's ravages in Ireland, when people were deported as indentured servants, sometimes called slaves, but they weren't slaves, but they were actually probably worse off, because if you're a servant, they can treat you for 7 years or for 14 years. They can treat you how you like. If you're a slave, they have to look after you because you're property. So in some ways they were worse off. Anyway, that's a separate issue. But we know she went out, and there was talk of her being in Barbados. So I said, here's a story. Person being burnt as a witch. She only spoke Irish at her trial. Irish-speaking person who was moved out of Ireland, taken to Barbados, and then, as happened, they went to New England after that as indentured servants. And I checked out New England, and there were people called Glover. They were there. And she obviously took on the slave name. It's a slave name, if you like. She was accused of witchcraft by a young girl, the same as the Salem witch trials, which happened 4 years after that. And she was tried by Cotton Mather, was one of the people. Cotton Mather, who was president of Harvard University. These are top people who believed in witches. And she gets hanged. So I said, that's a great story. So I'm going to write this. And so when you get an idea to write it, you have to research it. So I read a lot about the slave trade, about slavery, about the Irish in Barbados, the Irish in New England. You have to do a lot of research. Like the iceberg, you don't see it. It doesn't arrive in the book at all. And then I said, how do I write it? So I decided, just for the hell of it, to write it in verse, in poetry, rather than anything else. And I looked around and I said, well, there you have the model of Dante's Divine Comedy. So I took the model of heaven, of hell. I started with hell. So the book starts when she's hanged. And then the second one is purgatory, and I don't say that, where she is a slave in Barbados. And the Irish and the blacks had risings together. They rose up together in some cases. And then heaven, that was when she was a young girl back in Ireland. And what was it like in Ireland at the time? Now, Ireland was pretty rough in the 1640s and 1630s, but that's where it was. So that's why I did it. And it was interesting. And it was difficult to write. But while I was writing, I was in the middle of it, I was asked by Micheál Coneala, who's boss and founder of Clóir Connacht, would I be interested in, first of all, he had asked me, they were looking to translate Clé na Cille into English. And there was already a translation, a wonderful translation, hadn't been published by Tim Robinson and Liam McCarthaigh, which we'll come to in a minute. And he said, look, we're looking for somebody to translate it. Would you do 20 pages just to see what it comes like? And said, we're asking others as well. So I heard nothing from him. I was writing on Van Fassa. I got a phone call from one day and he said to me, he said, we gave the versions of 20 pages around to different people. And the way he put it was, some people, he didn't say them all, he said, some of them liked yours. Would you be interested in translating Cárthaigh Killer? So I said, fucking, I'm in the middle of a novel, but I'll do it because it was a challenge something I'd never done before. And I said, the only condition is that I can write it my own way. In other words, you leave me to do it, I'll do it my way. And he said, yeah. So the way the 20 pages were done, which was full of slang and modern English and so on, by the way. And I did it that way. For example, in the opening pages are Nibe on an item, food united, laughing, and I don't know, I'm in a pound place or the 5 shilling, 10 shilling or the 15 shilling place. I hope I'm not in the 10 shilling place, because in the graveyards in Connemara in Ireland, there were class places you could pay more. And then the second sentence is something like, which is translated by some people as, they have, in one translation, they have gone to the devil entirely if they've put me in a 10 shilling place. And I said, nobody says that anymore. Nobody says they've gone to the devil or the devil take you. So I said, fuck them anyway if they put me in the 10 shilling place, because that's what somebody would say. So I go on in that vein, you know what I mean? And I had great fun doing it. And I simply said, I will translate a page every day for a year, which is what I did. So every day I translated a page of Cárthaigh Killer, and there is Dirty Dust. And then they translated, they also published Liam McCarthaigh and Tim Robinson's translation, which I have to say is much more literal, much more faithful, a much better translation. But they were thinking that mine had more of the spirit, because I was kind of giving the fun and the gist and the jizz out of the thing along the way, which was why I did it. So if you are trying to learn correct Irish and using Cárthaigh Killer, go to Tim Robinson and Liam McCarthaigh. If you want a bit of fun, I'm not saying theirs isn't fun, go to mine, because that's the one that has kind of lifts it up. So
I think Nuala O'Connell, who's a great embracer of translation, has always said that the key thing for her was that the voltage of the translation would be
that's
correct.
it. The voltage, that's what it is, yeah. And she would know, because again, as Paul Muldoon has translated a lot of her poems, and he recreates them. So it's a matter of recreating it. Now, I was asked then to do also some other short stories and a novella, Fuil Fuine, which is, which I translated as The Dregs of the Day, which is 120 pages or something. So it's a novella. It comes, it appears as a short story in his, and again, people argue, is it a novella? Is it a short story? Is it a novella, short story? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's a piece of writing. That was a very different thing to do, because it's not full of fun and games. It's about a man whose wife has just died and he's totally lost, doesn't know what to do. And he spends a night and a day wandering around Dublin. And we know it's Dublin. And it's probably based on O'Kane himself, or at least some of it is. He maybe reimagined it. And so it's a serious one, and there isn't much language play. So I had to rein myself in when I was translating that, which I did. So it was good. It was good. I enjoyed doing it. And that came out in its own way as well. And I kind of did that. And then, I suppose I was writing more. What did I do after that? I did, I did a quirky detective novel. I hadn't written much about contemporary Ireland for a while. I had in some of the earlier novels and stories. So I did a detective novel, Law of Lavella, which again, is kind of, I used to like, smart-ass noir fiction, if you like Raymond Chandler and these guys. Mm-hmm. Dashiell Hammett. I think the writing is great. The writing's superb. I would love that kind of smart-ass American, in-your-face kind of writing. So I said, I do one of this. And I did. And it was, it got, some people said they were just laughing. It's a funny novel. And some people said it's the funniest novel. Some people better than on Béal Bocht, I don't know, but as funny as Béal Bocht, it's a laugh out loud novel in its own way. And but some people didn't like it. There was a bit of a controversy because there are two gangs of travellers in it. Now, one gang is good and the other gang is bad. And because the travellers were shown as being not very good, one reviewer in particular got very angry, saying, you shouldn't write like this, you can't do this word. She said, well, hang on a minute. Not all travellers are nice, Some of them, I know them, I taught them, I know them, come on. I've seen them, and they're a bare knuckle fight in it. I've seen it. Am I supposed not to put it into as a book? Because I suppose it's not like this. But the main devils in it are the Russian mafia. There's a Russian mafia who are flogging drugs around the country. They didn't get out. But anyway, that's what, at least people know, sir. And I believe, because I'm not on social media, I believe there was a big debate on social media about which is great fun, but I'm not part of that. But I did, the only time I've ever replied to a review, and the review Accords, the only time I replied, because I said, they can't let this go, because, and the reviewer kind of said, I wish he would say the things about civil rights that he writes about in the Irish Times, kind of on the right side of history and that kind of thing. I said, well, no, fiction is different. You're allowed to put bad people in, you're allowed to say bad things. I mean, in Merskin You Travel, the novel, where they're all black people, some of them are good and some of them are bad. They're not. They're all. In fact, Moira Vakate, when she reviewed it, said something the same, that I was giving some of the Africans a bad name. And they said, sorry, Moira, I lived with them. I slept on the ground. I travelled through the Cameroons. I went up into the desert. I slept on the same floor with them, and they're like us. They're good and they're bad. You lived in a posh house in Ghana, with Conor Cruz O'Brien, or in the Congo, I didn't do that. I knew them. I played football with them. I was part of the only white man on the black team, So when this kind of nonsense that you can't say bad things about people who are Irish speakers or who are saints, that's nonsense. So anyway, that's what I did. And so I enjoyed that. Then I had another book of short stories after it. I also did a children's novel, which I was asked to do a children's book for. I did several children's books. I nearly forgot about those. That again came up by accident. I was in, sounds great now, when Mary McAleese was president, I had been asked her to translate, she hadn't been there long, translate something. It was only a paragraph for something she was doing. She did into Irish. And at the end of the year, she had a kind of house party for anybody who had helped her during the year. So I got an invite up for drinks, and it was a lovely sunny day, and there were hundreds of people there, so it wasn't me, hundreds of them there, so that was grand. On the way out, Sean Murchel, who was in Angoon, he said to me, did you ever write a children's novel? And I said, no. He said, well, would you do one? So a bit like that, I went home that night and I said, okay. And the story kind of came, that kind of thing happens. You get lucky. Put the idea in my head and I can do it. So I wrote a mock, which won a prize, God help me. And it was basically a young brat. In fact, it's probably the most autobiographical story I've ever wrote, going around blowing frogs up, putting a straw up their bum and blowing them up, things that we did as young fellas. Disgusting, bastard little guys who were young. And so there's an element of that in it. And then I wrote another children's book later on. The other one I wrote then was Globalised, which I wrote in 2005, 2006 about, and again it had to do with Africa, because at the time, there weren't that many refugees coming. But I had spent time, when I was in Africa, I travelled around, and one of the places I nearly got to was Timbuktu. Went up into the desert and around. I had to return to my college. I couldn't do it, so I nearly got there. So I loved the desert. I thought the desert was magical. People think there's nothing in the desert. I thought it was beautiful. And the colour brown is a terrible colour, but in the desert it's lovely, and it keeps on changing. So that was one image that I had, just the desert. The other was, you're learning about awful things going on in Africa. And I heard about a village being wiped out. And I kind of said, well, what happens supposing a boy goes out to the well comes back and everyone's dead. What does he do? So, and people are coming to Ireland. And so I invented the story about a young boy and he meets a young girl and they have to cross the desert. They have to cross the desert. And they come, it's not, Ireland isn't mentioned. They have to come to Europe. They have to go across the Mediterranean. They come to another country, and he gets deported eventually, but that's another story along the way. So I said, I was in the desert. No, I didn't cross it, but you can imagine what it's like. And you know, I find racism one of the most awful things and disgusting, appalling that you can think of. And this is what people do. They cross the desert, and they tell the truth or they tell lies or they won't talk about it. In fact, my daughter had been working with some refugees, and she said they won't talk about their experience. They won't talk about getting here. They won't talk about crossing the desert. So to them, it was traumatic. So I had to write that. So that was one that I wrote. And again, that's and that's where I think, again, I remember at the time saying, this is a hot topic. And I sent copies of it to some of the major programs in RTE, like I think Sean O'Rourke's program. Nothing. You don't interview a writer in Irish. It just doesn't happen, even though this is what's going on in the world.
You know, that's a topic that I really want to focus on, because I think it's absolutely fascinating. But just having mentioned, I could listen to your account of your writing kind of evolution all day, and I just loathe to interrupt you. But I'm just, one of the things that's been itching me since since we began this aspect of the conversation is around Africa. And I'm just thinking of, you're in Nigeria, and, you know, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, you know, was a seminal novel at that time. And I was just recently reading a review you wrote of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book, the Decolonization of Language. You did a wonderful review of it in Core back in January, I think. And I was very interested just in, were you aware of the indigenous language kind of question happening there at the time?
You would be, obviously, because I mean, the first thing I'd say is the college in which I was teaching, it was actually a teacher's college, which was like an upper secondary school, because there was a literacy drive to get as many people into teaching as you can. So these were 17, 18, 19-year-olds, a lot of them. So they were quite good. And we were teaching African literature. Things Fall Apart was on the course. Weep Not Child by, as he was then, James Ngugi was there. I'm not sure that was on the course, but I read a lot of that along the way. But I would say that there was no boy in the class who had less than 3 languages. So they'd have a Yoruba, they might have Igbo, Obibio, Ijaw, Tiv, Hausa. They all had language. There was no problem at all. So I was very much aware of it. And because of Irish, I would have been aware that there was a language question with literature. So yes, it was very much in my head. And I did remember getting some small little booklets in Yoruba along the way. I learned a little bit of Yoruba, but not much, because I knew I wasn't staying. And it's a difficult language. It's a tonal language like Chinese. It depends on how you say it. If you use one word, it can go up and down. And so if you have a word like Abba, it can be Abba or Abba or Abba or Abba. You know, so like in Cork, you know, Abba. So you get along the way. So they have different meaning every time you do it. So I learned some, you know, bits and pieces, like go into the market and get stuff and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I was very much aware of the language question. And I said, when I knew, James Ngugi, who then came Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he was one of the first to say, hang on a minute, why are we writing in English, you know? Why are we writing in French? Let's write in the native. And as I said in that review and I said in that book, he got into trouble. And the publisher of his first novel in Kikuyu was nearly killed. There was an assassination there because they didn't want to do it either. So the old colonial mentality goes deep. So yes, briefly, I was very much aware of it.
He spent long periods in prison. And I was also fascinated by the fact that he was James Ngugi at that time. And later, of course, he chose to become Ngugi wa Thiong'o. And, you know, I was thinking of that, you know, that passage in an old Bail book where they're all jam such people, that even the naming, is so similar here to how
I think in his case, now I'd have to go back to it because I have his biographies up there on a shelf somewhere, two volumes of autobiography. I think what was going on was that people were given sort of two names very often. There'd be their own home name, and then there was the official name. So James would have been the official name, and then I presume and Googie would have been his own one. So we said Chinua Achebe, that didn't happen. They would normally, or Wole Soyinka, they kept their names. But there would have been places where the school or the state gave them other names as well. You find it with Chinese people in Ireland. They take on, they don't give you the Chinese name. So you have Susan or Alitia inside in the Chinese restaurant, and the real name is something else entirely. So yeah, I think that was the case. He was. I'd imagine he was. Yeah, I'd imagine he had a tribal name, or I don't like the word tribe, but he would have the national name, the home name, his own. And in Gaeilge, he'd have had that all the time, but he was James for official purposes.
And just for anybody, in case, in Ngugi wa Thiong'o, his most famous book, I suppose, that in English would be Decolonizing the Mind. And the reason I'm just particularly reminded of is that Alan just wrote a review in Core on a book published posthumously by him called Decolonizing Language. On that, Alan, to just bring it forward, of course, Core, you spoke about writing in Core. I mean, I think way back at the early stages of your career, you're still writing it. Now you're writing the Irish Times as Gaeilge every Monday. Fantastic resource for anybody wanting just to interact in the language on a regular basis. And of course, in Scale, on a Tuesday, you're writing pieces on like a master class on the prose writing in the Irish language. I remember reading, I think it was Tomás Mac Cárthaigh writing at one stage about just what he lamented, the kind of a dearth of kind of an intellectual life in the Irish language, and just because maybe people were reluctant to engage in maybe very caustic reviews of other people's works, given we're in a small community and so on. What's that like from your life experience looking back? What's that been like? And you've been just a huge stalwart of writing and commentary in the language. What are your reflections on that? Yeah,
I can see, number one, if Tomás said there wasn't intellectual life, well, there is, and there's some great books coming out. And I mean, just in terms of, I'm thinking of Brendan O'Buachala, another Cork man, who wrote Ashley Yare, 900 pages, which rewrites Irish history, but the Jacobites. And another Cork man, Liam O'Cahania, the Scéal Haman, the story of hurling. And they're two great books. They're high, and there's a lot about criticism. There's a lot of, there's a guy from the Czech Republic, Radvan, if we can mention the Czech Republic, Radvan, and he's written about Martin O'Kane. He translated Cléine Kill into Czech, and he's written a book about Martin O'Kane and the Carnivalesque, as a movie. So there's a lot of good stuff in Irish along the way. So it's simply not true as the case. With regard to book reviewing, something strange happened to me when I was writing in English that time for Hibernia many years ago. I was a young smartass, right? So, and I didn't know these people, so I could say anything at all I liked. And I remember writing about one person who'd written a book of short stories, and she and I hadn't said nice things about it. And there was Brendan Kennelly had this scheme called Writers in Prison, and you were to go to a prison and take somebody a writing class or something like that. And we met in Brendan Kennelly's rooms, and he was introducing us, and I was being introduced to this person who's written a review, and her hand was out, and he said, and this is Alan Titley. The hand came back. So I said, okay. And then there was another book that I did of a woman, and I learned later she was in a wheelchair. And I said, no, I'm not going to read a review unless I have something at least positive to say. No, it's not that I've had big intellectual arguments. When, for example, and some people know what this is about, when critical theory, that awful, accursed vain and useless piece of bad, leaky metaphysics was popular in Irish universities. And because the Irish mind has not been entirely decolonized, people decided, let's bring critical theory into Irish as well. So when I wrote on Tuairiscéal Gaeilge an introduction, I said, I haven't followed any theory, just my own, just writing my own. And it got, there were reviews, went to, you can't do this and this and that. So I gave a lecture on this, which somebody called it An Cogad in Aigna Critique, the war on criticism, the war on theory, really. And I gave it in Galway at a literary festival. And people were hopping mad. They couldn't, they said, you can't say these things. Because I was taking the piss, basically, on it. And I remember started off talking about two people. One was Tomás, and it was Bara, and they were swimming, two boys. And Tomás thought he would dive down to find out what was down deep, from tuma, meaning to dive. So Tomás, tum sheshis, he dived down to find out what was going on. Bara meaning the top, decided to stay on top and look around. So the guy who went down, Tomás, he never came up again to find out what was there. Whereas Bara was able to see everything that was all around. The idea that there's some kind of deep truth down there isn't. It is actually all around us. If you open your eyes and your ears, it's there to see. So people were going mad. And I started with that story, with mad. So that was a big intellectual argument. No, critical theory has been dead for 20 years. It's gone. They don't use any more. And for years, this was the stuff that people would talk about. So I have been in the wars, I have, but it's more, I would like to think, to attack ideas, not people. And so I don't like attacking. And I should say as well, attacking people, it can be dangerous if you're coming home from the pub late at night, if you've been in a bad review. I do recall when I was talking about the, what I said were the travelling circuses of Irish poets. And I didn't know Michael Davitt. Michael Davitt was 6'4" tall. I'm not. I'm 5'3" or 4" or something. And after some book launch, I saw this towering presence looking down at me saying, travelling circuses be Jesus. And he wasn't being nice about it. I got very friendly with him after that. So I said, this could be a dangerous business as well. Yeah. But I do think if you don't have anything positive to say, you're better not saying it. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't be said. And I don't object to people having a go at my stuff. I think that's good. As long, I think, as it's fair. And sometimes if you get a bad review, for example, when my play, I haven't talked plays at all, Teangan Godó, which is another one, which actually was on only last night in New York, so it's been translated into Russian, and it was produced in Kiev about 10 years ago, and French and Italian first. All from Irish. Every one of the translators did it from Irish, not from English. There was no English translation. Anyway, it's a separate issue. But when I did that, it got lots of positive reviews. It was great. I have them somewhere along there. I got one bad review in the Irish Times of all places. And the guy said, it's full of cliches. And it was. But it was a send-up of cliches. He didn't see there was a piss take on cliches. So when somebody totally misunderstands what you're doing, what can you do? What can you do, And another book that was reviewed, and I know a guy reviewed it deliberately in order to put it down for some reason that I don't understand. He got the book anyway, but that kind of thing happens. But most of the time, people are very nice, so that doesn't bother me. And it would be good that it would be a debate about these. It is good that a debate would take place, and it doesn't very often. I think it's a pity that you wouldn't. I do remember when Brandon O'Hare wrote Ligshinga Gahu. Shinach and Mahoan. There was a big debate over it, and there were people kind of whacking one another over the head over it. And it was a good thing. It's people saying it's a bad novel, it's an immoral novel, it's only about a youngster growing up, one saying it's very well written, it tells you about, so we don't have enough of that kind of stuff, we don't have enough of that. So I think the fact that we do know one another is a disadvantage. But I think the main purpose of reviewing now should be simply because there's so little reviewing going on, is we should simply tell people what the book is about, and that's what I try to do. I mean, in the column scale, I'm trying to do new books, and I do old books as well. You might have forgotten about these. And largely, tell people about it, give my own idea about it, So, there's no point in savaging a book like that. There's no point in reviewing with just to savage it. So if a book was being overpraised and people were saying things, yeah, it would. I do think there's a lot of bad poetry being written, it's there, but I'm not going to say anything about it. There's a lot of very good poetry, great poetry, but some really bad poetry as well. So, you're better off not to. Why would you want to savage some poor fecker who's, sweated his or her guts out writing bad poetry? But there's just great stuff. So concentrating the good as far as possible. It's better to be positive in general, which I try to be, I think.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful view of the world. I suppose that old, as you mentioned, cliches. That there's nothing worse than being talked about other than not being talked about. And I think getting you prefer the bad reviews than to be ignored utterly. And I think that's the one of the core issues I kind of feel from having spoken to you today and previously. And I'm reminded, and I want to just maybe, if you like, in terms of kind of wrapping up the conversation, I'll come back to where you started, in that you talked about going down to Levo Rochelle's bookshop, used to be on Plunga Street in Cork, it's gone now, and you might bump into Sean O'Riordan, and you said, hold on, there's what's that? Yeah. There's a poet standing over there. I didn't realize they even existed. I thought they're all dead and in books and stuff. So what about that today? And, the visibility of Irish language writers in the Irish language, or in the English language culture here today. Because, you've been doing this, you've been blazing a trail for just an extraordinary period of time, and have just a huge career and body of work. You're a one-man genre, basically. And, but you've been there long before, but now there has been this huge growth in the number of people who are writing in Irish now, and it's a thing that's it's a very vibrant community and culture. But to look at, if you were to read the Irish Times, or we had the 50, or what was it, the 100 best books of Irish, the first 100 best Irish novels of the 21st century, and not a single Irish language book.
No, that's where we're at. You see, that is a problem. And things have improved. There are a lot more poetry readings now. A thing like Imram, which I'm involved with, and it runs a literature festival. People come to it, sometimes in very large numbers. But if you go around to these cultural festivals, like the Dublin Book Festival, or you go to, and there might be, I think it was at it once. I think it was invited once. Or you go to the Dalkey Book Festival, or the West Cork Book Festival, or the Bally up in Donegal. There's several ones, the Michael Cleary Summer School. No, there are no Irish writers at all. And sometimes it's not, to be fair, if we can be fair, it's not out of bad blood to some, it's generally out of ignorance. And I do know that Liam Carson was involved with Imram, and he said he'll often just tell people, he said, look, why don't you do this? Why don't you ask this person? Why don't that person? And he said, normally they will do so. But unless they're told, it doesn't dawn on them that is going to be the case. So there have been ones that have been better than others, and usually it's down to one person. That there's one person who is in part of the organising committee who says, yes, we must get somebody with Irish in this as well. And in some ways, because of it's often struck me that there's lots of people out there with good Irish. They've done a degree in Irish. They've done Irish literature to a good level, or they've learned it. But they're not aware of these because the books are not reviewed in English either. And I know people, if the books were reviewed in English, in the Irish Times, or God help us, in the Independent or the Examiner, they would read them, or they'd know they exist. It doesn't there. And the only example of a book, an Irish bestseller, was Brown Down O'Hara's Líg Go. And that was back in the 70s as well. And that was because O'Hara was well known, radio and a TV presenter. He's writing for the Irish Times and the Irish press. He was involved in Come In Marianne. He knew everybody. And his book was bestseller, for a fortnight or something. That's on there. So they're there. And I do recall going to a play by Martin McDonagh, which was translated by Micheál Conneala, in the Peacock in Dublin. The Peacock takes 200 people. I know, because it's a play there, okay? And you count how many people are here tonight, So this was full by play translated by Micheál Conneala by Martin McDonagh. It was full, 200 people, when Martin McDonagh had a lot of plays on. And I didn't know anybody. I didn't recognise anybody. And they were all speaking Irish. So they're there, but they don't know. But they went, not because of Micheál Conneala, they went because of Martin McDonagh. And I think, so that kind of there's a funny little twist. If we got more publicity, then I think it would make a big difference. And when did you ever see a writer in Irish on Late Late Show? Or being interviewed by Joseph Clare Byrne in the morning, Oliver Callan? Anyway, it doesn't happen. And they have lots of things to say. There's another, T.G. Carr's motto, Sui Lene. It's the same thing. Another eye, another view, another look. That's what it's about. And I think Ireland is missing out when it doesn't see this other dimension. And there are things being said that are kind of not being said. And I mean, again, I waffle on about this. I did a lecture that I gave in Prague. There was a big conference in Prague a couple of years ago, and it came out in book form. And I looked at all the Gaeilge autobiographies again, and I read them all again. And I was looking for two things. One was I was looking for folklore or pichogues, and I was looking for religion. And I discovered there's virtually no priests. There were no priest-ridden societies. They were the odd one. They weren't afraid of the priest. And the other one was they didn't believe in fairies or hobgoblins or pukas. None of this. So like the kind of easy picture that's made of these things, it's not there at all. So that was another dimension which people miss out, to the kind of plastic paddy or to the silly version of Irish language writing that exists out there. And I think, you have to go back and actually read the stuff again to see what they're talking about. So
it's so true. And I just think it is such a huge shame, and something that we have to rectify here as a country, is to have these voices that are writing and speaking this language to be heard, in order for their works to be visible and then appreciated and understood. And I could listen and go on all day and all afternoon speak to you, but we've only scratched the surface of what's possible. And I feel just so grateful to you to having taken the time today. One of the things I'd like to wrap up on, a question that I ask generally guests, is why you do all of this. What's your Irish language why is? You've spent your life teaching in the language, learning the language through curiosity and your natural, obviously genius for it. But then also writing, reviewing, the scope of work that you've committed your life to doing. Why do you do all
Why
that?
would you ask me such a question? I have to answer it, or try to answer it along the way. I suppose part of it is that I think Irish, one way, taught me about Ireland in a way that nothing else did. So the knowledge landscape maps that I have in my head largely comes through that. I mean, it is possible, when I did my initial degree, it's possible I could have done other things. I did well in philosophy, I did English, I could, But I often thought, and I would nearly wake up in horrors at night saying, supposing I had done English literature, an literature person, I'd be talking about Joyce and Yeats and Heaney and Shaw, and all that stuff has been done. Again, I'd have nothing new to say about it. And I was discovering something that maybe... So that'll be part of it, I think, that and also I owe a lot to the language myself, just because... And I review other books then too, as a kind of a service, I think, to that community, and a kind of service to other writers. There's very few reviews going on, very few reviews going on. And I mean, for example, it was said to me by several people that the column I write the Irish language, I don't write about the Irish language at all. I don't. I never mention Irish in the column. It's a column about current affairs, about the world, about anything I like. But I've written plenty about Irish, about books and about the society and so on. So it's kind of a service, I think, because people have been good to me too. So I don't see why I shouldn't be good to them. And I know, like, for example, if I'm asked to write a letter of recommendation for a young academic, I do it with a good heart because people did it for me, you know? So there's a sense in which we're all in it together along the way. And, you know, there's a new kind of vibrancy about Irish as well. And, you know, that sui lele is there. I think that's another dimension to Irish life. It's something that's there for all of us. And you'd like to be able to, number one, enrich it a bit, like just enrich it a little bit. And you'd love to just spread the knowledge around a little bit as well. You can't do everything. And that's probably why I do it. And that may be incoherent and bumbling, but I think the answer lies somewhere in the cracks between those sentences, you know?
Well, that service, that spirit of service, that generosity of giving back to the language and those others that you've come up with in the community is absolutely, you know, extraordinary, remarkable, and thank you for doing it. Mil Magat, Akara, Alan, Akara, Buenos Ansult, Asan Scale, Ryan Tooling, Gurv Mil Magat, Fishin.
But Mila Fogder, if you also orum Agsasulium, Narosa Blodder, Eroig Roata.
Thanks for listening. Gurv Mila Mahagut Asave Eishtucht. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I would really appreciate your feedback and would be eternally grateful if you would follow, rate and review the show. Please also be sure to sign up at thelanguagequestion.com/resources to get your free valuable learning resources and to stay up to date with upcoming episodes, guests and to receive exclusive content. Slán Tom.